Hello again, YouTubers. This is the first video I'm doing on handgun basics. I expect to do probably 3 of these, with this one being on the actions and nomenclature of revolvers. And the next one will cover semi-automatic pistols, and then later I'll be doing one on things to consider when choosing a handgun for the first time. That's the third subject. There are already several videos on YouTube, but I decided to do mine anyway and give my perspective because in some cases it does differ a little bit from other people's. And there are several other different types of handguns, but I'll be limiting these videos to revolvers and semi-autos. The reason I won't be discussing things like single-shot pistols or derringers is because they are fairly specialized and have some unique applications, and anybody interested in those guns ought to be well advanced beyond the scope of these videos. Okay, so let's get started. Revolvers, as their name implies, are guns that cycle cartridges in a revolving cylinder. And modern revolvers fall into 3 categories. You have single actions, double actions, and double action only. Now, I don't own a double action only revolver, but I will explain what that is and why it's different than the others. These are often abbreviated as SA, DA, and DAO, respectively. So if you see those abbreviations, that's what those stand for. Okay, so let's get into a little bit more detail, starting with single actions. When it comes to handguns, basically, actions are defined by the mechanical effect of pulling the trigger. Okay. Single action revolvers have triggers that perform one single action, and that is to drop the hammer after it has been cocked. You can see on this Ruger Blackhawk, if I pull this trigger without that hammer being cocked, nothing will happen. So on these types of revolvers, the hammer has to be manually cocked, and then when the trigger is pulled, the hammer falls, firing the pistol. Okay. Now, double action pistols have triggers that perform 2 actions. First, they cock the hammer, and then they release it, allowing it to fall. And traditionally, double action revolvers have been able to be fired in either double action mode or in single action mode by manually cocking the hammer. And double action only revolvers don't allow any kind of single action firing. They either remove the hammer spur, which is this hook on the back of the hammer, or they may have a shroud covering the hammer, which prevents any manipulation of it at all. And with the advent of the double action only revolvers, traditional double actions are now sometimes being called single action slash double action, or SA slash DA. So if you see that abbreviation, that's what that means. Okay. So let's go over the parts of the revolver, starting at the top and working our way down. At the very top, first thing we have are the sights. You have the front sight and the rear sight. The next thing you have is the barrel, and revolver barrels range anywhere from 2 to 12 inches or more in some cases. All right. The next part up here is the top strap, and the top strap is what connects the front and the rear parts of the frame, and all of this is the frame, which is the main body of the revolver. At the bottom of the frame there's a trigger guard which protects the trigger, and on double action revolvers you'll notice that the trigger guard is usually part of the frame. However, on some single actions, the trigger guard is actually part of a trigger group or trigger assembly, and that can actually be removed from the frame by taking out a couple of screws. Alright, the hammer is the part that falls, resulting in the discharge of a firearm. And hammers vary. Most of them do have a hammer spur, like I said, which is this hook, which allows for manual cocking. But of course you will not find that on double action only revolvers. Now, some older revolvers and even maybe some of the say more inexpensive newer revolvers will actually have a firing pin on the hammer face, which would be just like a little spike that sticks out there. Okay. But most modern revolvers have a hammer that does not actually strike the firing pin directly. Okay. The firing pin is what actually strikes the primer of the cartridge, and on modern revolvers the firing pin is encased in the frame, and there is a transfer bar between the hammer and the firing pin. You can see this here. And the transfer bar rises up during the cocking phase and then retracts after the hammer falls. And guns that have transfer bars are far safer than guns that have a firing pin actually as part of the hammer. That's because of the space between the hammer and the firing pin when that transfer bar is retracted. And that means there won't be an accidental discharge as long as the hammer is down. Or at least there's a far less chance of that happening. Okay. So, that old rule about carrying a revolver with the hammer over an empty chamber applies to older guns or newer guns that actually have a firing pin on the hammer. And it's not really necessary with modern revolvers that have a transfer bar, because it's highly unlikely that there will be an accidental discharge, even if the gun were dropped directly on the hammer. Alright, next we have the cylinder, which we'll go into in more detail in a minute. And at the back of the gun is the butt, and the butt contains various springs and rods on the inside. And on the outside it consists of a back strap and a front strap, but in all of these cases that happens to be covered. And then you have the grip panels, or as they're commonly referred to, just the grips. Now all of these parts are found on all revolvers. However, single action revolvers and double action revolvers have some parts which are unique to them. On the single action there is a loading gate which can be opened, and allows cartridges to be inserted into the cylinders one at a time. Okay. Under the barrel there is an ejector rod, and you'll sometimes hear that referred to as an extractor rod, but since it actually pushes either live cartridges or spent cases out of the cylinders, it should really be referred to as an ejector rather than an extractor. Okay, there's also a base pin which holds the cylinder in the frame, and the base pin can be pulled out, which allows the cylinder to be removed. And once we have the cylinder out, we can take a closer look at it in more detail. As you can see, the cylinder has these chambers which hold the cartridges when the pistol is loaded, and cylinders vary from gun to gun, but they normally run from 5 to 8, with 6 being the most common by far. Alright, another part of the cylinder is the ratchet. And this just has little grooves in it which allows it to turn when it's pushed by another part, which is called a pawl. And that's P-A-W-L. Alright, and you can see that here. The pawl comes out and it protrudes from the frame, pushes the ratchet, which in turn revolves the entire cylinder. Alright. The double action is different in that it doesn't have a loading gate. It actually has a cylinder release, which is either a little button or lever, and that allows the cylinder to come out of the frame on what we call a crane. And this is the crane here. And if you look at the cylinder of the double action, you can see the ratchet and the chambers. But there is also another part called an ejector, which is the star-shaped piece right here. And that pushes out all the cartridges or casings at one time. And that's actuated by an ejector rod. And again, you might hear those referred to as the extractor and extractor rod. But really, they should properly be called ejectors. And sometimes you just hear them called plunger. And that's fine too. Whatever. Alright. The area directly behind the chambers is called a breech. And on either single action or double actions, this is the breech face. And the breech face will have two openings in it. You'll have a small circular one at the top for the firing pin, and then you'll have a larger, usually a rectangular one, which is for the pawl. And finally, under the barrel, there may or may not be a barrel lug, which it just protects the ejector rod from being bent. Okay, and barrel lugs vary a bit. They can be either short, like this one, or they could run the full length of the barrel. And in the case of full lugs, they're usually just grooved out to actually surround the ejector rod and protect it better. And they also vary in thickness to add varying amounts of weight to the front of the gun for balance and recoil control. And I also want to mention that there are no safeties on revolvers. Single action revolvers are kept safe by keeping the hammer down. Okay. And double action revolvers rely on a long, hard trigger pull in order to prevent accidental discharges. So forget that Hollywood crap when you hear that the safety's off on a revolver. They just don't have them. Okay, so without going on into the internals and looking at all the springs and rods and everything inside the revolver, that's pretty much all the basic parts. And like I said, the next video will be covering semi-automatics, so check back in for that. And as always, thanks for watching.